All right, guys, here we go. Topic 4, America Comes of Age. We're going to be looking at 4.1 through 4.4 in this video. This is the same material that your project covered and that we've been covering the last few days in class. Starting out, the Progressive Era. It's a roughly 30-year period between 1890 and 1920. It's not a big cohesive movement in terms of, hey, we're all going to do this, but it's more or less a bunch of different people, communities, citizens, etc., that are going to kind of form a movement in terms of they're going to be united by the idea of change and reform, politics, business world, education, religious stuff, and other things. They're going to try and change those things. Not big fans of individuals and social Darwinism, they're going to be more looking at, hey, we need to help and assist people just a little bit because all the bad things about society that are currently going on in our world are mainly because we've just said, hey, you're on your own. You make it or you do not, and that's on you. So they're going to ask the government and advocate for the government to get involved a little bit more, take a bit more of an active role. So they're similar to populism in that sense that they want change. They want the government to do a little bit more. But unlike the populists, they are not lower class, generally speaking. They are more middle class. They have enough money to take care of their basic needs, wants, etc. And if they save up and are wise with their money, they can often have some extra things. They are not the lower class because the lower class typically doesn't have time to focus on these sort of changes. They're too busy trying to make sure they make ends meet, whereas the upper class is so well off. Why in the world would they bother with these sort of things? It's not really their concern, doesn't really impact them. So that's why it's the middle class. That's why they make up the progressives. Their four main goals there you can see. Political reform, they want to try and target the corruption and all the political machines that are going through society. Women's rights, generally a greater voice. In order to do that, let's get the right to vote for women. The trusts are a bit of an issue for big business. They suffocate and minimize the impact that small businesses could have. And society in general, they want to make the living conditions and working conditions in cities better. Muckrakers, it's a negative term given by Teddy Roosevelt to these social crusaders of journalists. They're going to journal, create newspapers, books, pictures, etc. They're going to sit there and say, hey, look at all these bad things. They're terrible. Upton Sinclair's The Jungle is a great example. Jacob Riis here, one of them, he's one we talked about previously in class. He writes How the Other Half Lives, in which he uses a bunch of photographs to really show people what it's like in tenement and slum life. So that's his claim to fame, is using pictures to show and check this out, the negative parts of society. Lincoln Steffens, just kind of an example here. We talked about him a little bit. His big deal is political corruption. The political machines and so forth, people basically skimming off money, putting it where it shouldn't be, not using funds appropriately, etc. Upton Sinclair, he intends to draw attention to the meatpacking industry and all the poor working conditions workers endure. But what really ends up happening is people get an idea of what's going on in the factories in terms of health, sanitation, etc. And they get word and understanding of the things that they're actually putting in their bodies. So this is going to bring about a whole bunch of different changes, which we'll get to a little bit later. But things like the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, the Pure Food and Drug Act, Meat Inspection Act are going to come about as a result of this. Nellie Bly takes a look at mental health and the way people are treated in terms of being in asylums and that sort of thing. Social gospel, Walter Rauschenbusch, he talks about it. The easiest way to sum this up, we talked about in class, is, quote, what would Jesus do? What his general idea here is that Christians need to reform how they've been handling themselves. Let's go ahead and be more, like Jesus. Let's help our neighbors. Let's help those that are less fortunate than us. And this will apply in all the ways you can think of: food, clothing, shelter, opportunities, etc. From this, you're going to get settlement houses. They're going to come about. Jane Addams founds Hull House in Chicago in 1889. That's going to be the most prominent one, but there are several hundred others. Basically, a settlement house is an area, you can think of like a shelter almost of sorts, that's going to provide a bunch of services for the people that are poor and immigrants in the cities. They're going to be based out of the social gospel idea, which means that they are going to be aimed at helping those less fortunate, childcare, teaching English, giving an education, providing social programs, etc. Basic concept is just because they're poor doesn't mean that they don't deserve the same opportunities and chances and services that others that have money should be able to get. You can see here, this quickly shows children from about a 60-year period are steadily going to increase in terms of how many of them are in school, whereas the working population of children is going to slowly and steadily decrease. Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. Doors are locked. Try and keep women working and that sort of thing. Making their shirts. If they're taking breaks, sneaking off for breaks or whatever, that's going to cause problems, dip in productivity. So the basic thing we want to take away from this is that it's going to show the need for a bunch of regulations for safety and that sort of thing. Fire escapes, sprinkler systems, doors that can open, elevators that work, things of that nature. It's just going to highlight the need for safety devices, safety regulations, and so forth. Galveston hurricane kills 6 to 12,000 people in 1900 in Texas. It's the nastiest natural disaster in our history. So what happens as a result of this is it's going to lessen the impact of political machines and the power that they have. So what they would do, political machines, is that they would get a hold in politicians, or they'd get their own people from the machine in power, and then they'd be able to kind of run and organize the government as they see fit, take money, rearrange funds, etc., charge what they want, you name it. The Galveston Plan has this idea that what you can do is, instead of having one person that's either corrupt or maybe he's not experienced in everything, you're going to replace the city mayors with a 5-board commission. And this 5-person board commission is going to then, you'll have different experts in city planning, sanitation, etc., different things. So people can specialize a little bit more. Plus, it's a little bit higher to influence and buy people off in this sense. So where you could buy and influence one person as the mayor, it's much harder to do that with 5 people, which is going to then lessen the impact that political machines have. And the commission system here from the Galveston Plan is going to spread in general throughout several hundred different cities within about a 20 to 30 year period. So moving on here, direct primary, we talked about that a little bit. It's kind of almost like an election before an election. Donald Trump had to win the Republican primary, and so did Hillary Clinton, in order to determine that they were going to be their party's candidates for the 2016 election. So they go out and campaign, and then they, the voters vote. It's direct in the sense that there's no middleman. You vote, your vote is immediately counted. Whereas, we talked about in class how if Mr. Bidding says, hey, nap time after lunch or something like that, Mr. Hensinger asks your class and then you tell me what they said. You're taking me out of it in that sense, and then you are directly voting to Mr. Bidding. Same concept here. Nobody in the middle ground here for direct primary. You guys, your votes are directly counting for who's going to run to be the possible president or other political office. Initiative, the quick, simple version. You guys can check these definitions out. I highly recommend it. But basically, you want to get a law passed potentially without actually going through the congressional processes. Kind of skip the line, so to speak. What you're going to do here is you're going to get a bunch of different signatures for whatever you have, and then if you get enough, it's going to go on the ballot. So when people go to vote, they'll see your initiative, and then they'll vote on it. Depending how they vote will be determined whether it comes to law or not. Referendums, think of it as if a law has already sort of been passed, and they're kind of evaluating that law, debating about changing it. So they'll put a referendum on the ballot for when people go to vote, and they'll say, hey, do you think Law A is good or it is bad? And then once you've done that, they can adjust as needed, depending on what people say. A recall is when you get a public official. You're basically kicking them out of office in a sense they're not doing their job properly, they're not doing it well, maybe they're linked to some scandal or corruption. Not that they're necessarily breaking the law, but the recall is a chance to hold a special election and get somebody out of office who's not doing what they need to be. The 17th Amendment allows for direct election of senators, similar to the direct primary in the direct sense, and this one just focuses on senators. Progressive views on democracy, generally that the people need to be involved. Eliminate that corruption a little bit and then get the people involved. We're going to skip over Mary Walker here. The only thing really you need to know about her is just that she's going to wear what she wants. Whether it's, whose clothing you can see here, this picture where the mouse is. That's more male-oriented clothing, same with the top right corner a little bit. She's going to do what she wants because she's a woman and she can. She's going to be an advocate for social change. The general thing here under women's reformers are going to look for 2 major things: the right to vote and expand their voice, as well as the temperance movement on the limiting and or banning of alcohol. Florence Kelly, National Consumers League, she's mostly concerned about protecting consumers, whatever you're buying, whatever you're putting in your body, etc., making sure there's regulations, laws, and guidelines. Frances Willard, Women's Christian Temperance Union and suffrage. She wants to ban alcohol. The Women's Christian Temperance Union, that's going to be a big focus for them. Alcohol, in theory, causes all sorts of problems. Money being spent where it shouldn't. Wasted on alcohol. physical abuse, violence, etc., not being able to go to work because you're hungover, lack of productivity, etc. She's also going to focus a little bit on suffrage, or the right to vote, which many of our women's rights advocates will. Margaret Sanger wants women to have control of their own bodies, birth control, Planned Parenthood sort of thing. It's their women are saying, hey, it's my body. I should be able to do what I want. No one else should be able to tell me what I want to do with my body. Susan B. Anthony is all about that suffrage. Carrie Chapman Catt, again, suffrage. Notice there's kind of a common theme here with a lot of these women wanting suffrage, right to vote. Some are more mundane about it, and they're just like, hey, we should have the right to vote. Others are like, Alice Paul might be a little more radical, trying to go out and actively protest, etc. 19th Amendment is going to give women the right to vote. So again, that's the 19th Amendment, 1920, giving women the right to vote. Americanization. This is going to be a movement where immigrants, Native Americans, minorities, anybody that's not white middle class American, they're going to be encouraged and promoted to assimilate and become more like white middle class Americans in the culture, names, beliefs, values, whatever they want to do, how they act, etc. You could argue that this is a progressive idea in the context of it's going to theoretically eliminate some discrimination, that sort of thing. The more quote-unquote American they are, the less likely it is they're discriminated against. On the flip side, by asking them to give up who they are, their culture, etc., and change all that, that's not a very progressive idea. That's kind of, the opposite of the progressive movement. So is it truly progressive? That's for you guys to ultimately decide, but that's kind of the background there. Some things they might object, the way they talk, the way they look, their traditions, etc. Moving on here, African-American progressives. We talked about these guys in the past, so we're just going to kind of touch on them just a little bit. You've got the Niagara movement there. Going to be a bunch of people focus on equal rights in particular. Booker T. Washington, he's the guy, pull yourself up by the bootstraps. Better skills, improve ourselves, equal rights over time. We'll work within the system to do it. Whereas Webb Du Bois, he's more about equal rights now, and he forms the NAACP. He's one of the founding members in order to get that now. It's an organization that's going to help that. Politics, education, social issues, economic equality. The NAACP and Webb Du Bois are going to try and focus on that. Washington, however, he's not so much a fan of that in terms of how they're going about it. Let's, again, improve ourselves, build up our abilities, and we'll get them over time. So these two are not big fans of each other. Particularly Du Bois, he is really not a fan of Washington. Other groups that are being targeted, the Anti-Defamation League is going to be formed to help Jews and Jewish Americans to be safe from physical and verbal violence. So just kind of highlighting that it's not, these people are white, as you can see in the picture to the right there a little bit, but they are Jewish, so they're going to be discriminated there. So another group that's being discriminated against. Native Americans are going to get citizenship in 1924 with this American Indian Citizenship Act. They're going to become full citizens with full voting rights. This is in large part done to try and assimilate them a little bit. That's the main goal here. The fact that it didn't work in previous years, Dawes Act, etc., they're going to try and redo this. They're going to try and get them there instead of, make smooth things out. There's been resistance, over the years we've talked about. So this is a way to kind of help them assimilate, make them assimilate if you want to look at it that way, etc. And boom, there it is. You can see the guy on the far right there. He's kind of dressed, looks to be Native American a little bit, but he's dressed more as a quote-unquote white man. Teddy Roosevelt's going to become president after McKinley's assassination in 1901. Youngest president in history then, 42 years old. He's all about this strenuous life. Don't take the easy way out. If you want something, you got to work out at it. If it's not easy, then you're going to have to work at it. His idea with the square deal here, this is one of his major policies. It's square deal, and as we know, a square is round. It's got square equal sides. The whole goal here is to make sure that everyone has a fair opportunity. Does it mean you're guaranteed to succeed? No, but you should have the same opportunity. What you do with it after that is up to you. So the wealthy, the powerful, they shouldn't be able to get an edge just because they're wealthy and powerful and so forth. A smaller person, smaller business, and the poor should have the same opportunities, even if they ultimately do or do not end up as successful. So square deal, give everyone a fair opportunity. Government regulations, some things to look at here. Hepburn Act, the ICC, Interstate Commission or Commerce Commission group here. They're going to set maximum railroad shipping rates. This is going to be related to the populace, if we remember a little bit back in the day. Populace had an issue with regulations, and the farmers out west were suffering from high railroad rates, so they're in favor of this, and it's kind of a similar thing here. We talked about how the populace don't get anybody elected to major political office like the presidency, but some of their aims do get passed into law. This is an example of that. The ICC, the Elkins Act, you can't show favoritism to a railroad or to somebody paying on the railroad. The railroad stock value is going to drop, which is going to create a bit of a panic. So good for some people, but causes some other issues as well. The Federal Trade Commission is also created. This is basically just to make sure that monopolies don't form, keep an eye on businesses and make sure they don't form into monopolies, which is bad news for small businesses. These things here, Pure Food and Drug Act and the FDA, they're going to regulate food, drugs, etc. in the United States. Those come as a major result of Upton Sinclair's novel, The Jungle. Meat Inspection Act, same concept, regular inspections for meat and meat processing plants. And again, it's Upton Sinclair's The Jungle that impacts this. Quick look, this is the sort of thing that we're talking about here with all the meat and processing plants. Some more government regulation. The Federal Reserve Act in 1913 is going to get passed by President Woodrow Wilson. The general idea is that the banks didn't have anybody to oversee them. So one bank could be doing this, one bank could be doing that. And it's going to create the Federal Reserve, which is going to oversee all the nation's banking systems. It can change the money supply, how much money is actually out there. Do we pull some back? What do we do with it? This can affect inflation. This can affect the value of money. So in theory, you can control how the economy goes by having the Federal Reserve Act in place, because now there's something to actually control the banks throughout the United States. Teddy Roosevelt here, a trust buster. He's going to bust the trust. That picture of the right, though, kind of depicts he's got a good trust on a leash. So basically, if you play by his rules, you're good to go as a trust in theory. The bad trusts get the axe, and they're going to be killed off, so to speak. So play by his rules, and you're good to go. If not, see you later. This is Teddy Roosevelt's views on the trust. He's known as a trust buster, but he more or less only goes after the ones that he sees as bad and harming American industry and the American people. Managing the environment here, getting close to the end. John Muir is a naturalist. He believes, don't mess with nature. Let it do its thing. They're going to visit, I believe it's Yosemite Park. You can see in the picture there. And the basic concept of what's going on here is Roosevelt's going to really admire this guy. Roosevelt's kind of a rough and tumble guy. He's a quote-unquote, and this is in heavy air quotes, he's a man's man, a guy's guy, going to go out there into the wilderness and rough it and all that sort of thing that you can stereotypically think of what that phrase might mean. So in that context, he's a very much an admirer of John Muir, and his guy that he gets to help run this sort of stuff and organize it is Gifford Pinchot, who's the chief of the U.S. Forest Service. And he's really just like, hey, let's just get this stuff under control and manage it so that way we don't lose the forests and all that sort of stuff and all these natural resources. So Teddy Roosevelt is a big advocate for the environment, in part because of his admiration for John Muir. President Taft is going to win the 1908 election. Fun fact, he's the only president in our history to be both a Supreme Court Chief Justice and a president. He has more of this dollar diplomacy versus big stick diplomacy, which we'll talk about a little bit later in the chapter. But short version of it is Teddy Roosevelt wants to show you, hey, look, if you don't go by our plans here, we're going to go ahead and beat your head in kind of idea until we get what we want. Whereas Taft's like, we're going to throw money at the situation until you do what we want. We'll pay you to do what we want, basically. And so throughout that, they've got different ideas on how to handle certain things. And Roosevelt's like, hey, this will be great. Taft's company's a Republican. We're on the same page. Turns out Taft has his own agenda a little bit, which upsets Roosevelt. So then Teddy Roosevelt is eventually going to run in 1912 for the election. Had the Republicans been unified here, Teddy Roosevelt, by splitting off and creating the Progressive Party, a.k.a. the Bull Moose Party, he pulls off some of the votes that Taft might have gotten. Kind of similar to the 1860 election a little bit, where the Democrats split and they pull votes different ways, which allows Lincoln to win. So Taft and Roosevelt split the Republican Party, which is going to allow Democrat Woodrow Wilson to come in and take the election. You can see the election map right here. Woodrow Wilson, for the most part, he wins virtually everything. You can look at the popular vote. You could argue that if the popular vote of Roosevelt and Taft were combined, that might give them enough electoral votes in the various different states to go ahead and give them those states for the Electoral College and have them win. But because they split the Republican Party, it takes power away from each the Progressive, aka Bull Moose, and the Republicans, giving the election to Woodrow Wilson. Some things Woodrow Wilson does, 16th Amendment, that's going to be federal income tax. So if you guys are getting a paycheck and you see income tax taken out, you can thank President Woodrow Wilson, 1916, for that. Federal Reserve Act we talked about in the FTC. The Clayton Antitrust Act there a little bit is, again, just reinforcement for antitrust issues and that sort of thing. So check all that stuff out. You can check out this crash course stuff here a little bit. You know, in particular, a couple of questions here. Alcohol is made illegal because, you know, with the, excuse me, I think it's the 18th Amendment. That's going to be made illegal. The temperance unions are going to get their wish. Not really losing a lot of money there, though, because it's still going to be done. It's just illegal. Taft's going to fire Pinchot. Roosevelt's, you know, dude for the forest and all that sort of stuff. That's going to cause some problems. Wilson's platform that he runs on is called the New Freedom, which is, you know, let's give everybody opportunities compared to Roosevelt's there. That's going to wrap it up for 4-1 to 4-4. If you guys have any questions, feel free to email me or anything like that. Good luck on the quiz.